What happens when your alarm is set for 4 a.m., but you wake up wide awake at 2:30 and think, you know what? Might as well just go. That's exactly how this past weekend started for me. A solo drive from Winnipeg to Saskatoon in a Chevy Equinox EV, a cousin's wedding, a campfire, a nap in a parking lot, and more charging stops than I can count on one hand. If you've ever wondered what a long prairie road trip looks like in an electric vehicle, stay with me because today we're getting into all of it. Welcome to True North EV. Hey everyone, welcome back to True North EV. For anybody who doesn't know, my name's James, coming to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba. If you're new here, welcome. This show is for anyone who is curious about EVs, already driving one, or trying to figure out if electric makes sense in a country where we sometimes have to drive really, really far to get anywhere. And this episode is a perfect example of that. Last weekend, June 12th to the 14th, I drove my 2026 Chevy Equinox EV from Winnipeg out to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and back for my cousin's wedding. And I tracked basically everything, every charging stop, every kilowatt, every dollar. Well, I guess I didn't really track it. The My Chevy app tracked it, so that was super helpful. So today we're doing a full trip breakdown. Let's get into it. First, a quick word on the car. I'm driving a Chevy Equinox EV. If you've been around, you've heard me talk about it in previous episodes. And heading into this trip, it had about 5,912 kilometers on the odometer. So it's still a fairly new vehicle for me. The night before I left, I had it plugged in and charging at home overnight. So I rolled out of the driveway at 90% state of charge. Because I was planning on leaving about 2 hours later, it only got up to 90%. So one thing I want to mention, because I'll reference it throughout the episode, I used the My Chevy app, like I said, almost exclusively to start my charging sessions and track stats on this trip. It was honestly pretty easy to use, a little slow sometimes finding my location or pulling up the right chargers on the map. But once it connected, it worked great. I'll talk more about it as we go. All right. Let's hit the road. So the plan was to wake up at 4 a.m. and head out for about 4:30 in the morning. I had my alarm set and everything. But if you've ever had one of those nights where you're just too keyed up to sleep, that was me. I woke up at 2:30 in the morning, wide awake, totally alert, and I just thought, why wait? I got everything packed up, loaded the car, and was rolling out of Winnipeg by 3 a.m. There is something genuinely special about driving across the prairies in the middle of the night. It's pitch black, roads are empty, and honestly, it's peaceful. I saw raccoon, I saw coyote, there was a bunch of deer signs, but no deers, but lots of raccoon and a few coyote. So yeah. So my first stop was actually in Neepawa, Manitoba. I arrived at 4:24 a.m. and left at 4:59 a.m. My first stop wasn't actually planned. The car's navigation hadn't preconditioned the battery for it, which I'll explain in a minute, but after about an hour and a half of driving, I just needed to get out and stretch my legs. I pulled into Neepawa, which has a Tesla Supercharger, in the co-op store right next to the Tim Hortons, and decided, well, while I'm here, might as well top up, use the washroom, and grab something to eat. There was a Tim Hortons open at that hour, which honestly, classic Canada. I grabbed some breakfast, ate in the car, and unplugged at 87% state of charge. Here are the numbers for that stop. So we added 39.7 kilowatt hours. It cost $23.33. My average charge rate was 65.7 kilowatts. My peak charge rate was 90.1 kilowatts. I gained 211 kilometers of range and the battery gained 39%. Now the reason the average charge rate was a bit lower than peak and why the peak itself wasn't as high as it could have been is that because that was an unplanned stop, the car didn't do what's called battery preconditioning. When the car knows you're heading to a fast charger, it warms or cools the battery to get it to the ideal temperature for charging. Without that, you're not getting peak performance out of the charger. Still worked for me, just something to keep in mind. And I did basically stay there until I was finished eating, went to put my garbage in the garbage can, and then unplugged the car. So it wasn't that I stayed there any longer or any shorter than I needed to type deal. Stop number 2 was in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. I arrived at 8:07 a.m. to the charge point. I'll get to that in a bit. And at the Tesla Supercharger, it was 8:24 a.m. and I left at 9. My next planned stop was at Yorkton. The Equinox did precondition the battery for this one, which was great. The issue was the car's navigation sent me to a charge point charger on the opposite side of the city from where I needed to be, and that charge point had a max speed of 125 kilowatts compared to the 250 at the Tesla Superchargers, so not ideal. I pulled in at 8:07 and did charge a little bit there, just enough time to pull up my apps and confirm there was a Tesla Supercharger in Yorkton. So here's what I got at charge point. I plugged in basically for, about 5 minutes, 8:07 a.m. to 8:11 a.m. My average charge rate was 51.3 kilowatts. My peak charge rate was 55.2 kilowatts. I gained 19 kilometers in that short a time and 3 on the battery. Then I unplugged, drove back across the city to the Canadian Tire parking lot where the Tesla Superchargers were, because of course that's where they are. Got there at 8:24, and here's where it got fun. While I was charging, a woman was already there with her Cadillac Lyriq. She was using the flow chargers that are kind of right next to the Tesla Superchargers. You'll see that a lot across Canada is actually Tesla Superchargers and flow chargers right next to each other. It was all part of the NRCan Natural Resources Canada funding program. My goodness, it must be almost like 5 years ago or whatnot. It was a way to help install more chargers. But you had to have it accessible for everybody, so that's why the flow chargers and the Tesla chargers are there. So she saw the sign that is on the Supercharger stalls that said for Teslas only, for Tesla charging only, I believe is what it said, and assumed she couldn't use them. I got talking to her and let her know actually that most Tesla Superchargers in Canada are now open to all EVs with an adapter, and I'm not totally sure why that sign is still up there. She mentioned that she had tried to use Tesla chargers in Davidson, Saskatchewan with her GM adapter, and it hadn't worked. And that's actually because Davidson is, I believe, one of the only Tesla Supercharger locations in Western Canada that is still Tesla only. So that was a totally valid experience, just an exception to the rule, not the norm. And hopefully that little conversation saves her some time on future trips. And I also had to pop into Canadian Tire while I was charging because I had completely forgotten to bring a chair for the campfire after the wedding. So problem solved. So here's the Tesla stop in Yorkton. So I got there at 8:24. I went till 9 a.m. I added 57.9 kilowatt hours of power. It cost me $34.04. My average charge rate was 91.8 kilowatts, and my peak charge rate was 136 kilowatts. I gained 309 kilometers, and I gained 56% on the battery. So now we're on to stop number 3, was in Windward, Saskatchewan. I arrived at 10:48 a.m. I departed at 11:13 a.m. Most of these stops, I just kind of go walking around. Just kind of get out of the car, stretch my legs, go wander. So from Yorkton, the car said I could make it to Saskatoon, but it was going to be close to 3.5 hours of driving. I decided to do one more stop in Windward, which is about 140 kilometers down the road, just to buffer the range and to get out of the car and stretch. This stop had a bit of a tech moment. The My Chevrolet app wasn't showing the Tesla Supercharger in Windward, only the flow chargers that are right next to the Superchargers. I found out later that you can zoom in further on the map in the app, and you can tap on the other charger icons. But in the moment, I didn't know that, so I just switched over to my Tesla app to initiate the charge. Works fine. Just means the cost and history didn't get logged into the My Chevy app. I did pull the stats though from the My Chevy app though, just not the cost. But I believe it was about $23, I want to say, but I'm not 100% certain. So I did plug in at 10:48, unplugged at 11:13. My average charge rate was 72.1 kilowatts. My peak charge rate was 92.8 kilowatts. I gained 184 kilometers and I gained 32% in the battery. The car did precondition for this stop, which helped, and from Windward, it was about 200 kilometers to Saskatoon, smooth sailing from there. So I rolled into Saskatoon early afternoon, and because I was staying at an Airbnb with no charging access, I did want to top up to as close to 100% as I could before I started running around the city. I stopped at a flow charger near some shops and restaurants, right next to some Tesla Superchargers, actually, which I could use. But here's the thing. I still had about just over $30 left in my flow account from when we had our Kona Electric, so going back like 3-4 years ago. And I wanted to use it up, so flow it was. Now this charger was slower, only 50 kilowatts, so the stop was a bit longer, but it was right next to tons of shops and restaurants, so it honestly wasn't a bad way to spend an hour and a half. I got some stuff done, grabbed something to eat, and didn't even mind the wait. So I did get there at 1:27 p.m., stayed till 3:01 p.m. It did cost $23.55 from my flow account, like $10 left, but it just starts nagging at you. So I added 55.4 kilowatt hours. My average charge rate was 34.3 kilowatts. My peak charge rate was 39.3 kilowatts. I did gain 319 kilometers, and I gained 57% on the battery. So one thing, again, I'll mention, the Flow app kept popping up notifications when my balance was getting close to even $10. So a bit annoying, but I get it. I ended the session just under 100%, close enough. Then it was off to doing a bunch of running around, visiting family and whatnot. And then on Saturday, it was the wedding and campfire. So more running around in the morning, going across the city back and forth because I was at one end of the city. And the rest of my family and the wedding was all at the other end of the city. So the wedding and campfire was just outside the city on Saturday. Great day, great family time, great catching up with cousins and aunts and uncles. I don't see nearly enough, but the campfire went on to well into the evening. So I think I finally took off from there at about 9:30 p.m. As it was winding down, I headed back to my Airbnb, got everything packed up and cleaned up, and then I lay down in my bed and was wide awake again. You know what? I had been planning to leave by 4 a.m. at the latest. It was about 11:30 at night. I thought, screw it. I'm heading home. And just like that, the return trip began. So we go on to stop number 5. It was back to Windward, Saskatchewan. So that's the return back. So I arrived at 1:30 a.m. and I departed about 2:12 in the morning. So the first stop on the way home was back in Windward. By this point, I had figured out the My Chevy app, had to zoom in, find the Tesla chargers specifically. So this session was fully logged. I want to be upfront. I was in no rush. I was tired, it was the middle of the night, and I used this charging stop to nap in the car. After charging, I parked in a darker corner of the lot, hopped in the back seat, and actually caught maybe about 20 minutes of sleep. I didn't bring a pillow, so the one problem was using my son's booster seat as a pillow. Those things are like hard plastic. I really feel sorry for any kids that have to sit on those. Like, they need way more padding in those. So, but again, did about a 20-minute nap. Honestly, really useful feature of having an EV on a long drive was the car is quiet, it's comfortable, there's no engine running, not a bad place to rest. There's called the utility mode, cat mode. Bunch of different manufacturers have kind of the same thing, but you can keep either the heat or air conditioning on. Stay nice and comfortable while you're sleeping. So basically arrived at 1:30. Left at 2:12 a.m.-ish, so more probably about 2:30, 2:40-ish. I did add 54.6 kilowatt hours of energy. It cost $35.97. The average charge rate was 73.3 kilowatts. The peak charge rate was 130 kilowatts. I gained 286 kilometers of range and added 54% to the battery. Stop number 6 was Yorkton, Saskatchewan. I arrived at 4:16 a.m. and left at 4:46 a.m. with a quick stop back in Yorkton, just a planning stop to top up and figure out the last stretch home. So I added 24.6 kilowatt hours of energy. It cost $15.62. The average charge rate was 50.5 kilowatts with a peak charge rate of 56.6 kilowatts. And I gained 136 kilometers of range and 26% in the battery. Stop number 7 was Russell, Manitoba, so a newer stop. So I arrived at 6:09 a.m. and departed at 6:20 a.m. So about an hour's drive, but 105 kilometers-ish from Yorkton is Russell, Manitoba. Quick stop. This one had an issue with the My Chevy app. Either poor signal or some kind of glitch meant it couldn't get the charge session started. It switched to the Tesla app and it worked immediately. So again, no cost logged in the My Chevy app, but it wouldn't have been much anyways. I believe it was like under $7. Again, time was 6:09 to 6:20 a.m. I added 9.9 kilowatt hours. The average charge rate was 49.2 kilowatts. My peak charge rate was 50.3 kilowatts. Range gained was 48 kilometers and 9% of battery. Stop 8. Final stop actually was Portage La Prairie, Manitoba. I arrived there at 9:58 and left at 10:10. This one is nice. I'm almost home. Portage La Prairie is about 270 kilometers from Russell and just over an hour from Winnipeg. This was a quick top up, barely 12 minutes, and then I was basically done. So in Portage La Prairie, it's connected to, I believe it's a Sobeys grocery store. So nice little store to go kind of wander around, grab snacks or whatever. So it is kind of our kind of go-to stop if we're kind of heading out at a normal time. But again, when I left to go out to Saskatoon in the morning, they obviously were not open, but it's a nice place to grab snacks or whatever on your way out. But yeah, so plugged in at 9:58, left at 10:10 a.m. and I added 24 kilowatt hours of power. It cost $15.72 and my average charge rate was 107.8 kilowatts. My peak charge rate was 133.4 kilowatts. I gained 124 kilometers and 23% on the battery. From Portage, it's about 100 kilometers and just over an hour back into Winnipeg. And just like that, trip was done. Nice and for the most part, easy, especially with the My Chevy app and basically the car kind of doing all the trip planning for me. So it didn't really have to do anything. Even on the infotainment screen, it basically says, 6 out of 6 chargers working or 4 out of 6 chargers if other people are charging. So now that we're through all the stops, let me share a few things that really stood out to me on this trip. First, the range prediction was remarkably accurate. When the car said you'd arrive at a charger with 15% battery remaining, you'd arrive with 15%, maybe 16 or 17 if traffic was light and you gained a bit of efficiency. That consistency made planning genuinely easy. You didn't have to second guess it. Second, I used cruise control almost the entire way and drove at the posted speed limit, 100 kilometers an hour in the 100 zone. On the way home, I was getting a little antsy the last few hours and may have been doing, 5 or 10 over. Definitely affects efficiency, so keep that in mind if you're pushing range. Third, the My Chevy app. It really was the backbone of this trip. It let me start charging session, track every stat, and see my charging history after the fact, which is where most of these numbers I shared today come from. It was a bit slow sometimes, and the charger map required some zooming in to find all the available options. One thing I also noticed, you can stop a charge from the car's infotainment screen, but I found it actually probably didn't work about 3/4 of the time. So not a deal breaker, just something to know, but I know when I was stopping it from the app, it would usually work then. Fourth, the parking. Most of the Tesla Superchargers I stopped at were quiet at the times I rolled through. So I was often just parking sideways across a stall and plugging in easily. When I did need to pull in properly, the 360-degree cameras on the Equinox were really helpful for judging how close I was to the charger. So for anyone without cameras, a spotter or just going slow works fine too. But you got to get really close to the chargers, especially, third generation, second generation chargers. The cord is short. And finally, the campfire chair. Don't forget your camp chair. I had to buy one at Canadian Tire while my car charged in Yorkton. No regrets. Great chair. But just remember to actually grab all your stuff. I did have a little list and somehow I still missed the chair. But I guess that's the nice thing about these kind of longer stops is it allows you to get out, wander, grab stuff that you might need. All right, let's talk money. Because I know this is one of the first questions people ask about EV road trips. And honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of this whole experiment. So total spent on charging for the entire trip, Winnipeg to Saskatoon, driving around the city and back, was just over $150. And keep in mind, 2 of my stops I was using the Tesla app instead of the My Chevy app, so those costs weren't tracked. The real number might be a few dollars higher, but we're solidly in the 150 range. You know what? Let's just call it, about 180? Now, let's compare that to gas. The one-way distance from Winnipeg to Saskatoon is about 787 kilometers. And in driving around Saskatoon, errands, the wedding venue outside the city, and back and forth, and you're looking at well over 1,600 kilometer trip at a pump price of around $1.56 per liter, which is what I was seeing around Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan was a little bit cheaper in price than Manitoba. Manitoba is about 160, 162, 163, somewhere there. So I went off of 2026 Chevy Equinox gas vehicle. So kind of apples to apple comparison, gas Equinox to Chevy Equinox, and you're looking at over $200 in fuel. Probably closer to about $220, $230 with all the errands that I was running. So we're talking a savings of between $50 and $100 on a single weekend trip. And that's charging exclusively at public fast chargers, the most expensive way to charge an EV. If I had access to level 2 charger at the Airbnb and could plug in overnight somewhere along the way, those numbers would look even better. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend cost savings alone are the reason to go electric. There's a lot more to the equation than that. But in a prairie road trip like this one, the math works. And it felt pretty good pulling into the driveway in Winnipeg, knowing I've done the whole thing for the price of a couple of tanks of gas, if not less. Actually, I think my work truck alone is probably about almost $200 in gas just for filling up my work truck. So a quick word before we wrap. If listening to this episode has you wondering whether an EV could work for your lifestyle or which one might be the right fit for you, that's exactly what my EV consulting business, True North EV Consulting, is here for. I work one-on-one with people across Canada to help them find the right EV or plug-in hybrid for their needs, their budget, and their driving habits. And I don't just help with picking the vehicle, I walk with you through the entire process. From the first, I'm thinking about it conversation, all the way to taking delivery and getting the home charger installed. The goal is to make the whole transition to electric feel comfortable and straightforward, not overwhelming. If that sounds helpful, check out truenorthev.ca and send me an email at truenorthev@gmail.com. I'd love to chat. I also want to give a quick shout out to the Manitoba Electric Vehicle Association. If you're in Manitoba and interested in connecting with the other EV drivers, sharing experiences, or just staying up to date on EV news that matters here at home, check them out at Manitoba E. Great community of people who are passionate about EV adoption right here in our province. And one more shout out before we go. If you want EV content from someone who is generally way more knowledgeable and polished than I am, go check out Bodhi's podcast, Kilowatt. Seriously, fantastic show, great depth, and Bodhi really knows his stuff. Highly recommended as a companion listen to this one. All right, that's a wrap on the Saskatoon road trip episode. Thanks so much for joining me, and also I still need to go wash all the bugs off the front of the Equinox. Prairie driving, you know how it goes, especially in the summer. Before you go, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. It really helps other EV enthusiasts find our show. And if you have a topic you'd like us to cover, send us your suggestions at truenorthev@gmail.com. This show is for all of us. You can follow us on Facebook at TrueNorthEV and find more at truenorthev.ca. I'm James, and I'll talk to you next time.